Futurized goes beneath the trends, tracking the underlying forces of disruption in tech, policy, business models, social dynamics, and the environment. Join me, futurist Trond Arne Undheim, PhD author, investor, and serial entrepreneur, as I discuss the societal impact of deep tech such as AI, blockchain, IoT, nanotech, quantum, robotics, and synthetic biology, and tackle topics such as entrepreneurship, trends, or the future of work. I'm a research scholar in global systemic risk, innovation, and policy at Stanford University. On Futurized, I interview smart people with a soul, founders, authors, executives, and other thought leaders, or even the occasional celebrity. Futurized is a bi-weekly show preparing you to think about how to deal with the next decade's disruption so you can succeed and thrive no matter what happens. Futurized, conversations that matter. If you're new to the show, seek particular topics, or are looking for a great way to tell your friends about the show, we've got the episode categories. Those are at futurized.org/episodes. I'm the co-author of Augmented Lean, a human-centric framework for managing frontline operation, and the author of Health Tech, Rebooting Society's Software, Hardware, and Mindset, Future Tech, How to Capture Value from Disruptive Industry Trends, Pandemic Aftermath, How Coronavirus Changes Global Society, The Disruption Games, How to Thrive on Serial Failure, and of Leadership from Below, How the Internet Generation Redefines the Workplace. For an overview, you can go to trondundheim.com/books. At this stage, Futurized is lucky enough to have several sponsors, and to check them out, go to futurized.org/sponsors. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or to get an overview of other services provided by me, including how to book me for keynote speeches, please go to futurized.org/store. We'll consider all brands that have demonstrably positive contributions to the future. Before you do anything else, make sure you are subscribed to our newsletter on futurized.org, where you can find hundreds of episodes of conversations that matter to the future. Please also leave a positive review on iTunes. Thanks so much. Jamin, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I thought would talk about gaming. That seems to be something you've been up to for some years.
Yeah, a little bit. I play a couple games here and there.
Yeah, that's cool. Look, I always try to do this. I'm going to butcher your background in one sentence and see if I get it right. And I'm then obviously interested in how you all packaged this all up. But you actually went to Harvard and did social studies.
I did,
which could point you in many directions. But you quickly got into Wall Street Journal as an A&E, arts and entertainment reporter, which that's quite particular, I would say. And then you turned media entrepreneur, gaming marketing expert. You got, I think, some PBS web series, game show, host of a podcast now, founder of Twofivesix strategy consultancy down in LA, and working on and commenting on the future of gaming, having some big clients. And so my question then is, why did you get a life in gaming?
Well, I'd always played games, throughout my life. That's something that I've appreciated as I get older, like how my generation, I turned 40 this year, and so I'm a bit of a cusper, so between Gen X and being a millennial. But for folks certainly younger than me, anyone under the age of 40, it's the first generation of kids to grow up without knowing anything other than video games. So I think about my parents and their peers. They had to make a decision about whether or not games were going to be a part of their lives. And for me, it was already very much in the water as a 80s kid. So Nintendo and Sega, and then later on PlayStation, Xbox. But I didn't really start getting into games seriously until I was a journalist, and this was around 2007. And there were a lot of new game platforms that were coming out around that time. I think that was a real sea change for the games industry, just because of how much activity was happening. Some of it was generational. So you had a generation of kids who had been growing up on video games that were now entering their 20s, had disposable income. Some of it was just a change in technology as well. So what you saw with things like the PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360, but then also this widening of the gaming aperture, so to speak, in terms of the types of places that you could play games. So the App Store was launched right around that time. So all of a sudden you could play games on your mobile phone. The Nintendo Wii came out right around that time as well, which obviously introduced a whole slew of people who were not traditionally considered, quote unquote gamers who were purchasing Nintendo Wii and playing games and injuring their elbows and whatnot. And so I think there was a real, that was around the time that you started to see also, just from a dollars figure, you started to see gaming is starting to eclipse other types of commercial media. So things like film, TV, books, all of that stuff. All of a sudden, gaming from a commercial standpoint is really ahead. The challenge has always been that the commercial viability of games has always moved faster than the public's cultural literacy of it. And so that's where I found myself, where I was like looking at the number of people who are playing games. The average age of a gamer at this time is like ticking up 36, 37, 38. Now it's 39, which is, roughly the average age of, humans. But what I was finding was that, even though I thought there was a ton that was going on, I felt like there was a big gap. And then I had a big conversation with my editor when I was at the Wall Street Journal. I was like, hey, look, this games thing is huge. I should be focusing more time and effort on that as an arts and entertainment reporter. And he was like, I don't get this games thing. So he just like shuffled me off to, cover other things. And I ended up leaving and, starting an independent magazine and media company. But I started to find similar conversations with brands as well, where they sort of see, and I think that's particularly coming out of the pandemic, I think you see things like Animal Crossing, which was very popular during the pandemic. You look at the growth of games like Roblox, the continued growth of games like Minecraft. And so you're starting to see this like generation, particularly of like senior marketers who have kids who are playing Fortnite, who are doing things. And they're like, I get that games are a really big deal, but I don't really get it, and I need someone to help me get it. And so that's why we started Twofivesix, was basically to help clients be able to ultimately like get it. But it all stems from like a personal, like a deep interest in gaming, deep intellectual interest in gaming. I think it is the future of where entertainment is going to continue to go. So in the macro sense, like gaming is just going to continue to become a bigger and bigger piece of our lives, and we're moving out of a world where people ask, do you play games? And we're moving into a world where people ask, what games do you play? That dinner table conversation, the concerns that people might have about, quote unquote, exposing themselves as someone who play games, each year that passes, that becomes like less and less of a concern. But there's still a big gap, I think, between, there's still a big generational gap. And so we often are helping folks who are looking for ways to either deal with like organizational resistance, or sometimes it's just strategic, basically strategic concerns. How do we just go about taking that next step? There's so much you can do in gaming. How can I make that decision to do something interesting?
Look, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think it's so easy still to pigeonhole a gamer as, and I have teenage kids, and, you say, oh, a teenage boy playing video games in their room. But even with teenagers, right, it's girls playing games, and yet, like you said, we adults also grew up with games. How do you see this idea of gaming really as one unity? I mean, is there a commonality here? Is this related to what I really did grow up with, which was board games, or is that kind of a whole different strategy? I mean, is that why we do this? Because there is a strong connection back to because I guess board games has kind of this communal element of like 2, 3, 4, like very low amount of people, right? So there's a kind of a different dynamic there, which I think we should talk about too. There seems to be this persistence of people wanting to still have these face-to-face experiences. Now, board games is one thing, but is all of the variety of online games, is that kind of coming from that same interest, or is it something different?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the gaming is a subset of play. And so, gaming, video games, board games, sports, those are all under that subset of play. Those are generally like, more rule-based forms of play, as opposed to, I have a 10-month-old, she'll start doing something that's less rule-based, much more imaginative, but it kind of falls under this broader category of like human behavior that, that I would call play. One of the things that got me really interested in games was there's a Dutch philosopher named Johan Huizinga, and he wrote this book called Homo Ludens right before World War II. And this was, it was a lesser work for him. He was a well-respected theorist and anthropologist. But he basically said that, that games are, that play is at the root of all human culture. So it's not that play is a subset. Play is the superset. everything out of culture emerges out of out of play. And that was really inspiring for me because I felt like, as someone who was like an entertainment person, I was seeing different places where I'm like, that taps into something really deep. And so I think one of the challenges has been that when you look at the history of video games in particular, we often ignore the pre-video game period. So during the 70s, Dungeons and Dragons was really popular. It's a popular face-to-face, mostly a board game, right? And then when computers started being developed, that generation of first video game designers were looking for ways to translate some of the experiences that they were having playing games like Dungeons and Dragons into a computer context. And so we ended up with this kind of bifurcation where board games kind of went this one direction, and then you had computer games, and then later computer games, and then later video games kind of move in this other direction. But they're really part of the same family tree, and they tap into a lot of the same impulses. And I'm sure you certainly see that. I see that whenever I think about this. I was just home for the holidays, and I brought some board games, and I was thinking, I'm like, okay, the kinds of board games that I like are going to be different from the ones that my family likes, but we all sort of enjoy board games. And video games are the same way. Everyone's very different. They like different things. They want different things out of those experiences, but they're all part of the same sort of category of human behavior. So board games, video games, and then I would say sports also fits in. That's probably outside of the range of this conversation, but those also, they're all very similar in that respect in terms of what they tap into for us as players.
Well, that's funny. I don't know if this is relevant, but one of my teenagers plays basketball and also plays basketball games. So plays 2K.
Yeah.
Now he was into Fortnite for a while as well, but there is a striking, I guess, kind of congruence between this interest in physical basketball and the fact that the game, I guess, is so real, and at least he claims that he can pick up some tactics and strategy from doing this, and then obviously watching basketball. But the three almost seem to like morph together into one whole, and I found that kind of interesting to observe. And I guess that brings us a little bit into the future, but there are all of these ideas about what games will become and how immersive and wonderful they will be. But I guess the truth is also that they're pretty immersive already. Like, we immerse ourselves. It's a little bit, I guess that was my question here. Is it, is the interface currently limiting us in games, or do you think that human imagination is so strong that we're not really sitting there waiting for the perfect technology to come along? We love games, and we have loved games for forever, regardless how simple they are set up.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, that question of immersion. I think when people talk about that, I think there's, at first blush, you would think that immersion is related to like fidelity, like how photorealistic the image is. And I think the video game industry, because of the technology industry, has really raced towards making that a priority. How do we make something more realistic? And that certainly can be a part of it. But there are plenty of, I would say that the games I played growing up were far less graphically complex, graphically realistic, but I was 100% captivated by them. And so our brain does have the ability to fill in the gaps between sort of what we might be seeing on screen and what we're feeling at that moment. So I don't think it doesn't mean that the desire to make things more realistic is on face a bad one, but making something realistic does not necessarily make something necessarily immersive. And we see that with other media as well. Like, go back and watch old films. Like I watched The Revenant recently, for example. I'm watching Mad Max again. Like, these are like highly visually complex films, but you can go back and watch older films. I've been watching this film Sullivan's Travels, which is a Preston Sturges film from the 30s. Also deeply engrossed in that in a different way. The mechanics for that film are 100% different. Or a film like M, for example. Like, these are. It's not a question of like, it needs to be more or less realistic. That question of immersion, I think, with gaming is sometimes can be a bit of a fool's errand. So I think we're fine. Like, if games become more realistic, that's great. If they don't become more realistic, that's great too. I don't think that will define whether or not something is or is not immersion. So we're both there and not there yet in terms of like what games are and what they ultimately could be.
Well, I guess that brings us to the question of how do you create a good game concept, and that a lot of people are interested in this. I'm sure your brands are. If I'm a would-be game entrepreneur, I'm interested in this too. Like, is my idea going to be an actual game? How hard is it to create something that has I guess these two characteristics, if we're talking about brands, they both games with strong concepts, and they have some aesthetics or some ulterior quality to it that it refers back to the brand in some clever way. I mean, I'm not trying to do your job here, but I would assume that at least those two characteristics are fundamental, because otherwise, my guess would be you could create a fantastic game, but if there's zero relationship, just slapping your brand on it is the same as like, any company just, paying for for an ad on TV or in a sports game. You have to work pretty hard to make the association. Maybe it doesn't matter, but I would assume that the best games, you're associating it closely in some way with
No,
with the message.
yeah. So we break the world of gaming from a channel standpoint in terms of like where you can sort of be as a brand, live, place advertising, whatever that might be. I'm in the three main categories: play, share, and experience. So play is what you're alluding to. So it would include making a game, but that also could include things like in-game advertising, for example. The share layer is things that are happening in a community around a video game. So that could be like Discord channels. It could be engaging on things like Twitch. And then we also look at the experiential level as well. So that could be IRL events. So it could be fan conferences, it could be get-togethers, board game nights, as well as conferences, those sorts of things. And so we really encourage brands when they're thinking about to try to sort of widen what they think that they want to do and also what they're able to do. Because when someone comes to us and says like, we want to make a video game, for example, we really discourage people from that being the first touch point, for the same reason that, if a brand says they want to record an album or something like that, it's like, oh no, our brand team's going to put together some music and we're going to try and sell it to the public, right? You'd be like, well, is that your literacy? Like, do you have musicians on the team, right? Making games is incredibly difficult. The good news is, I think the good news is that more games allow for more opportunities to do something in game than in the past. So that could be everything from placing advertising inside of a game itself. So there's more platforms that allow for that, which is great. I think you're also seeing some of the bigger games, whether those are games like Fortnite or games like Roblox, that are looking for options with like digital fashion, for example. So some of the barriers to entry, I think, for brands in terms of doing something in a video game context are starting to lift. It is getting easier. That said, super high touch. There are a variety of other challenges. Attribution is a huge one. When let's say you make an island in Animal Crossing, it's very difficult to know whether or not, how do people get there? Where are they going? Because these are games. They're not, it's not like Facebook or Instagram or, where these are advertising platforms fundamentally, and they're built around selling ads at the end of the day. That's what their business model is. That's not how video games function. They're not designed in a way to maximize, advertising, basically maximizing return, on advertiser spend for brands. So that's just something you have to know, like going into it and making sure that you pick the right place. On top of all of the other challenges is your audience there. I had someone recently, a woman who runs a fashion line, and she was really interested. Fashion has been has been a place, we can talk about this a little bit more, but fashion has definitely been a place because of the growth of digital fashion on places like Roblox, Minecraft, et cetera. Burberry just did a thing with Minecraft, for example. Balenciaga has done stuff with Fortnite, right? Which makes a lot of sense. They make, physical goods. And so creating digital goods in those contexts, it makes a lot of sense one-to-one. But I was asking her, like, tell me a little bit about your audience, because she wanted to do something in Fortnite. And she's like, my audience is mostly, women in their 30s and 40s. And I was like, Fortnite may not necessarily be the best like place for you. And that's a consideration. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do something in games, but it just means that you need to align like what your potential activity is going to be with where your audience is, on top of all of the other difficulties around like creating.
Well, that's my question, right? Because if you're saying there's such a variety of games, so if there are all of these sort of micro platforms, essentially, if you're a big brand, how do you deal with that? Because theoretically, you'd have to be in like 90 games to matter, like not in one game. Yes, okay, fine.
Yeah.
So if Fortnite fits your profile, that's great. But what if you have a product that potentially, you'd have to split it out in many different games? Is that the kind of work that you do? Placements?
Yeah, absolutely.
Of presence,
yeah, no,
basically?
100%. Yeah, I mean, one of the things we just did a big research project over the past year with the folks at Eyes for Research, big survey project, just getting a sense. We wanted to complicate the way that we think about gamers as an audience, and one of the things that we found coming out of it was basically that big nets lose a lot of fish. So the most loved and most hated game genres were exactly the same. So amongst people who identified as gamers based on retail spend, a game like Fortnite, like Battle Royale, was a most loved genre for a cohort of people who self-identify as basically who identify or basically meet our screening criteria as gamers. But it was also the most hated for another set of the same group of people who also have a similar amount of like retail spend. So I think for brands, it's really an understanding that one size does not fit all. Just doing something with whatever the big game du jour of the moment is not going to cover your bases. And also, conversely, there are sacrifices that, because you do something in a given game context, that might be appealing to some people, but it's going to be unappealing to another group of people. So I think just getting an understanding of, that gamers are complicated people and you do need to make some hard choices, and that should ultimately be driven by audience research. We do that for clients where we sit down and figure out, like, let's look at the gaming lens for your existing audience, and then let's look for a lookalike audience as well to make sure that what you want to do in gaming is aligned with where your audience already is. So we had a client recently. Who was really interested in doing stuff with esports, competitive gaming. And when we spoke to their audience, we spent time with their audience, did survey work with their audience. We found that the things that they were actually interested in was cosplay, dressing up as their favorite video game characters, and board games as another one. Had nothing to do with a competitive esports, but esports was that's the thing that was on the in advertising trade magazines and in media publications. But for their audience, what their audience wanted was opportunities for self-expression, for self-identity, and so they're going to gravitate toward and social connection. So they were going to gravitate towards games, platforms, game communities that allowed them to do that. So the challenge for brands is you just need to make sure one size doesn't fit all, and just make sure that you do your research and you know who you're speaking to. In that sense, it's not rocket science, and yet you'd be certainly would be surprised.
Yeah. So I know you did some work with YouTube. That's one platform. I mean, video more generally, it's a broad platform with a lot of things going on there, right? There's creators, and then there's brands themselves, and all kinds of things. And it's a strange platform, really. A lot of stuff going on YouTube. How do you think around that medium right now?
Yeah, I mean, my relationship with YouTube, first started as a reporter. I was reporting on social media, and YouTube was a site where memes really developed. I mean, there are other places where memes had image-based memes developed, but on the video side, I mean, you think about like viral video. YouTube was the place where things like that happened, right? So someone would upload something on their camera and it will go viral on a place like on a place like YouTube. Obviously, there are other places to do that as well, but that was my first kind of introduction, I think, to virality was definitely like through YouTube. And then later as a creator, I hosted a show for PBS Digital Studios that really focused on video games at the intersection of like games and culture. But now, working with YouTube, as a client, YouTube is a fascinating place because it does house so many different types of video content. So first of all, games are a huge driver on YouTube. I think people don't always know that. YouTube obviously curates what you see, what you individually might see, but there's a tremendous amount of gaming content on YouTube, and it lives in a lot of different ways. So you have things, you think about the life cycle of a video game that would include like an initial trailer. So the announcement for a video game that generates a certain amount of activity. Then when a game is launched, there's going to be reviews. People record videos with their takes, and then there's this huge long tail of basically tips and tricks, community content, just people engaging with game universes. I mean, it's the depth here, and it changes obviously from region to region, just because not all games are played the same in different places, and so you have these macro and micro communities in places like Brazil and India, and so it's been really fascinating to think about YouTube as being this depository for like where video game culture really lives. And there's so much that happens. It's intersecting with each other on top of the content creator side. So you have people from other platforms like Twitch or TikTok who are building a presence on a place like YouTube. So it's a really, really unique place, I think, for video games. I mean, all platforms are unique, but YouTube definitely, because of the the visual and video based component of it, and because video games are a visual medium, the relationship between creators and between games publishers and between the audience there is really special and really unique. So it's been a lot of fun working with them, helping them identify what are the micro and macro trends that are happening on their games platform. So Minecraft, for example, just crossed the trillion view mark, for example, right? And so we work with them on behind the scenes on some of the announcement and celebratory material that came out. I wrote an essay for them about the significance of that event as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a great place to play. I mean, definitely I would consider it to be like a first stop for any brands that are looking to do something in gaming. YouTube absolutely should be a part of your strategy.
So it's funny that, I mean, there are obviously these somewhat winner-take-all platforms in gaming that that become very, very big. But then there is this persistence of an enormous undergrowth of all these other things going on. It must be even frustrating or hard, I guess, to track that as a professional, because it's not one person's job anymore, right? Because if it is just YouTube, and that's all, that even that is like massive, right? Because it's essentially Google for video, right? It's everything. But then you add all these new platforms, entrepreneurs, gaming platforms that help people make games, with lower thresholds for starting, to create games. They're just enormous. So, where do you cut your research off and say, hey, that's too early for me? Like that game, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, we have three guiding criteria. We look at organizational fit, we look at audience fit, and then we look at marketing fit. So organizational fit is, is there, you would be shocked or maybe not shocked, not having buy-in from senior leadership or from peers on a marketing team drives a lot of like what is possible. Like the possibility space of what you can do with games is driven by your existing organization's strengths and weaknesses. And so if you have a brand that is communicates to its audience in a particular way, that's going to dictate, that is definitely an input in terms of thinking about how you should be working with gamers. On the marketing side, marketing fit really just alludes to, some of it's related to like what your budget is, for example. That's a big driver. There's stuff that you can do in gaming at any budget level, but having more money creates new challenges, but also new opportunities. Having less money has challenges and opportunities. And so, and then basically what that marketing team has done in the past. Are they deeply socially literate? Do they have the capabilities to monitor something like a Discord channel, for example? Or is it a bit more traditional and you want to look for something that's, say, like out of home or experiential along those lines? And then the last one is audience fit, which is some of what we discussed already, is just making sure that you're targeting the right group, the right cohort of people. And so the intersection of those three things really helps put some shape to like what a brand can ultimately do. I do really think that like when we work with clients, that's something I really appreciate, is like they can't know everything about gaming. We know a ton, even at Twofivesix, like we know a ton about gaming, but there's still areas and places where we still need to dig in and make sure that we really know and we understand what's going on. But that's why I think that's the gap that I was alluding to earlier. People sort of recognize, like, it used to be, it's funny, when I started, I was at the Wall Street Journal and then started a video game magazine. I often, when I was having conversations with people, they would say things like, oh, video games, that's a really interesting niche, right? And at that time, games were 40, 50, $60 billion industry. It's not like this is not a small thing by any stretch of the imagination. But there was a perception that gaming was very small. I think, thankfully, we've moved out of that stage. I'm less in a evangelistic mode now. I don't have to convince people as much that games are a big deal, but it creates another set of problems, which is like, you see, you're on the beach, you're looking out over the ocean and you're like, I can see land on the other side, but how, there's stuff there. I want to be there. What do I need to do to actually get to that place? And so that's where we step in and help out. So that's something that brings me a lot of joy, is just helping people, basically, if we can help them cut to the chase, so to speak, and pick the right strategy to reach the right audience at the right time. But that's a lot of what drives, my interest in the business. And that's a lot of the value that we like bringing to clients, because, it's hard for them. They can't know everything. That's why you need specialists. That's why you need experts to help you kind of like solve that problem.
Yeah, no, I get it. And I was just going to ask you one question before I want to move to the future and where this is heading. But first, is it a problem sometimes that a client might come to you and have this idea that they think they want to do gaming, but they have just picked up gamification right? So they're like, I want to gamify this. And there's no game in mind. They don't even really want to do games. They just want to gamify.
Yeah.
So, because I've heard that, I've probably said that myself. I mean, let's gamify this.
Yeah.
Well, so now you're just jumping into some hype word. You don't actually want to engage with a game. You just want to get the aura of a game.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
about?
the good news is, the good news is that, I have friends who work for other, creative service and professional service firms. I'm not alone in that respect. The clients will sometimes come with an idea of what it is that they want. So, if you've worked with design shop, web design shop or whatever, clients come, it's like, I want this, this, and this, or I saw this website, is this possible? And you're like, well, that's not within your time and budget constraints, et cetera, et cetera. So some of that is just the nature of working with clients. They pay us. And so that demands our respect and attention. So what we look for is to try to affirm the impulse, like what brought you here, like what is it about, say, gamification that you're interested in? Is it that you're under pressure? That's why those fit questions become really important. I was like, are you under pressure to deliver something brand new? Do you have some anxiety about missing out on, say, like Gen Z, for example, and this is your way to do that? Is it that you're mostly focused on impact and you've been told that gamification is a way to, basically drive conversion? So starting with a set of questions to really sort of get behind that. It's something that we see a lot right now with like the metaverse, for example. It's been very interesting to me. I've been in and about the game space the last 15 years, and every couple of years there's some new term that kind of pops up that is basically just another way to say video games. So at one point it was virtual worlds when Second Life was emerging. Second Life is still a big thing. It's there are still hundreds of thousands of people that play Second Life. It's but doesn't command the same kind of media attention. And folks were saying we gotta get into Second Life. That's a thing. That's a thing that we need to be doing. Or World of Warcraft. We need to be getting into we need to be doing something in virtual worlds. Then it was gamification when Farmville was popular. On Facebook, it was like, oh look, there's some secret sauce, this gamification sauce that we can sprinkle and juice engagement. Then after that, it was esports, right? So looking at competitive video games that are being played live. And now most recently with its metaverse, we need to be doing something in the metaverse. At the end of the day, we're just talking about video games, which is fine. And so that's the point. That's the stuff where we try to poke clients. It's like, okay, you seem to be rebranding or just taking things that you're seeing and somebody's telling you that there's this buzzword that you need to be using. I want to affirm that you're looking in the right spot, but the way that you're looking, the language that you're using won't help lead you to the right solutions. Because when you do stuff in gaming, that needs to be a long-term commitment. So you need to make a commitment to do something. It's not a one-off place where you can just do something that's like one-off. Gamers as an audience do not like that. As any customer, any fandom, they don't like when brands drop in, do their thing, and then peace out. So we just want to make sure that, if they're coming to us with a solution in mind, that might be the right impulse, but we just want to make sure that it's done ultimately in the right way.
I think it's interesting you said that about the metaverse, because I guess it's not that the metaverse isn't anything. There is a direction towards immersion in games. There is the thrust is there, right? There's a desire. There are AR and VR tools, and there's headsets, and there's all kinds of things happening, but it doesn't amount to a world in any meaningful sense. It's not a place right now, I guess, where we all are next year going to hang out and change everything that we do in the physical world. How far away is that in your mind? Even immersion in game, like true game immersion, for like all of your gaming hours, you will be immersing. Will you even be doing that?
Oh man, I don't know. I think from a hardware standpoint, I think my understanding is we're probably whatever people have in their mind, we're probably 10 to 15 years away from that. I think what I encourage folks to think about is I think there's often a perception that gaming is some kind of stepping stone to some other thing. And the thought experiment I would ask folks to say, like, what if it turns out that the metaverse is only video games, only being the operative word there? How would you feel about that? Would that bother you? I mean, to me, that's not a bad, if the only thing that VR headsets are useful for in a B2C context, because I think there's lots of B2B applications that it's useful for.
I agree. That's a whole other issue. But the industrial metaverse actually does exist in a certain sense. I mean,
100%.
there's
So
digital twins, there's serious investments for very, very limited use cases, like, docking to the International Space Station. They're actually doing that in VR. That is happening, or in like extended reality, at least, flight simulators, right? There's a certain use case there that's not going to go away. But I guess what some people are
yeah,
talking about with a metaverse is this idea that it is a verse, like it's everything.
yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
big.
Yeah, I mean, what if it is
Yeah.
only the set of video games, or it's only the only reason that people go and buy a VR headset in a consumer context for holiday or birthday gift is just to play video games? How would you feel about that? Like, and so that's the part for me, because when we look at like what, when we look at like where the metaverse is today, it's like we're talking about a handful of games. We're talking about Minecraft. We're talking about Fortnite. We're talking about Roblox. All of those games are over 10 years old, or around a decade old. So they're not new by any stretch of the imagination. They're very mature, and they absolutely eclipse things like Decentraland or, Horizon Worlds, like by, magnitude. We're not talking like, oh, they're twice as big. We're talking they're like 10, 15, 20 times as big. So I think this idea but it's very convenient, I think, for non-video game makers to step in and say, hey, look, this is we're all part of the same community. We're part of the metaverse. So our encouragement is like, look, if what you're interested in is, immersive experiences that allow people to engage socially with others, that create opportunities for brands to create meaningful connections, as long as you're just talking about video games, then you're in good shape. Once you start talking about the metaverse stuff, it's like, yeah, you're talking about something that's like far, far away. And I have to be thinking about stuff that's next quarter, next year, not stuff that's 10. As much as I would love the luxury to be able to think on that 10, 15, 15-year horizon on behalf of clients, they just don't really have that kind of time. So that's the big thing for me. It doesn't bother me as much as it used to, as long as we're being clear. It's like when we're talking about the metaverse, we're actually just talking about video games, and we need to be intellectually honest about that and not pretend, because what will happen is that term, the metaverse, that's not going to make it, but video games aren't going anywhere. So I just, I just think we just need to be crystal clear about what it is that we're talking about here.
You think the term metaverse will die, or like a silent death, basically within
I
a few
mean,
years?
I think, for better or worse, I mean, you have, one of the largest companies in the world renamed themselves after this term. And so it's kind of like, I guess the metaverse will work if Meta as a company continues to work for the long term. But whether or not that term, that the metaverse is something that people continue to use, I don't think and to me, it's like, from a branding standpoint, like, it doesn't matter, in the same way that, like, we used to call I think Matthew Ball has made this point that, like, we used to call the internet the World Wide Web or the information superhighway. Like, whatever it is someday, we probably won't call it that. Like, augmented reality is a good example. Like, people aren't interested in AR because it's a technology called AR. They're interested in it because it does things like face filters, or you can use Pokemon Go. But if you ask people, like, if you say, hey, look, this thing has AR, that's not interesting to folks. So if you tell people, like, hey, this is part of the metaverse, that's not interesting. As long as there needs to be something to do there. Like that piece, using metaverse as a branding concept to try to shorthand your way to an immersive experience, is, to me, just that elides the hard work of actually making something interesting, making something unique. So what we call it is less important to me, as opposed to like what we ultimately end up doing, and what we do, that's driven by hundreds of millions of people around the world, not like a handful of folks at big companies who kind of determine, what language folks are going to use. So humans are very surprising in that way. So that's what makes me pessimistic, is like kind of that top-down branding exercise, to me, feels like not the right way to go about it.
Yeah, so let's bring us back to what I think we seem to agree matters, playing games as an activity that expands the mind in some way and makes us human and interesting. Where is that going? Because that seems to me even more fundamental, right? Will we be playing games 50 years from now? And regardless if some of the shell around the game, or the name, or the platforms we're playing them on will change, but what kinds of humans would be, I guess, if we don't play games? And do you see any of that happening? Is there a danger that we will let the AIs play the games or something, and that we would just sit back and then not have that enjoyable experience of being immersed in a game? There is something playful, well, the word is playful, but is that something we're in danger of losing, or do you think it's just so human that it is not in danger of being lost?
Yeah, I'm not concerned. I mean, I think in the short term, I have maybe some concerns around just I have some concerns about maybe like lock-in. I was mentioning, if you look at Roblox, Minecraft, Fortnite, like these games are still very dominant and they've been around for quite some time. There's still a tremendous amount of on the other hand, the number of companies generating more than $1 billion in revenue has gone from 10 to well over 30, and so there is both an expansion in terms of because the pie is continuing to grow each passing day. People raise their hand and they are playing games. Millennials, some of the research that we did found that millennials are continuing to play games. That's really important. So we tend to think of gaming as something that you quote unquote age out of, right? It's like, oh, I turn 18 and I stop playing games. Our research indicates that that's not the case, that millennials are still continuing to play games. That's certainly true for myself, even though I have a daughter and, I don't have as much free time as I used to. Gaming will always be a piece of what it is that I ultimately end up doing. I think it's definitely a permanent and fixed behavior for each passing generation. I think for me, the stuff when I think about like the future of games, you mentioned one, what our relationship to artificial intelligence will look like. I think about it in the context of things like Chat GPT, where I'm like, oh, I can see video games using that for dialogue someday and creating as a, it doesn't, again, that in of itself does not make a game good, like using like AI speech, basically AI speech or AI text generation in of itself does not make a good game. But I could see it being a really cool tool for game creators to be able to do stuff at scale with small teams. I think that could be really, really cool and interesting. So game makers have been using AI for years, going back to Conway's Game of Life. So artificial intelligence in games have gone hand in hand for decades. But it is, I think, what it will do for small teams and smaller creators to generate something at scale. That's really interesting. Really good example is Minecraft, for example, which was developed by one guy, and he was able to do so much with technology, basically creating these seeds of worlds that then would generate these basically randomly generated experiences where you have one guy who creates these entire biomes with just a set of code or text. So that kind of possibility for small teams, I think, is really, really interesting. The other big thing I think about when I think about the future of games, when I was growing up, if you look at the history of games, you mentioned board games. Gaming has been social throughout its entire existence up until the video and computer game age. So it's even going back to arcades in the late 70s, once arcades start dying out. And there's this gap in between where arcades, for the most part, in the United States and Europe, and they still live in places like Japan, and South Korea has PC bangs, and I mean, other places where you have PC cafes and people are playing games. But for large parts of the world, video games become a private activity. But the internet is not yet strong enough to be able to deliver real-time experiences for large people. So for me, growing up playing video games, you have this huge cohort of millennials going through playing video games, mostly in isolation. Video games, if you talk to Gen Z and certainly the generations below them, will always be a social experience. That's what's driving them to be multi-platform. They want to play games with their friends, their social spaces. So the thing that interests me is that generation that now thinks of games as primarily being social experiences. What are the games that they're going to be interested in as they get older? And more importantly, what types of games is that generation going to make? Because those are going to be different from the ones that I'm interested in. So I think you can't really understate the extent to which, particularly for younger millennials and for Gen Z, how social these experiences are and how destigmatized gaming is as a term. All of their friends do it. It's not a dirty word. It's a place where they go and hang out. And I think that's going to have profound impacts on like the future of gaming, because the future of gaming is going to be driven by players. It's not going to be driven by corporations. It's driven by players. So, those are the two big things that I certainly look at: AI and the social side of gaming. I think those are the two big things on the future of gaming that excite me the most.
Super. This was a great conversation. I learned a lot. It's a field that I guess we all need to need to realize that it takes our own engagement with it to understand it, right? It's not something that we can talk about it a lot, but I'm reminded that you kind of go back and tap into your own gaming experience to remember what this whole thing is actually about. And then I think we, at least if you're younger than 70, right? There were games. I mean, there's even table games, obviously, for everybody. But if you have had even a remote kind of experience with video games, there seems to be a continuity there. There's something still, at heart. It's a similar experience, but like you said, it's been more or less social. So I guess that takes us back to you studied social studies. So games for you still is a social study. That's good to hear.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's gaming has had a leadership position with many different types of technology. Things from AI, for example, was experimented with video games. For example, if you look at the last set of tech entrepreneurs, many of them played video games or got into coding, for example, because they wanted to do stuff with video games. So if you want to get a sense of like where culture is moving, gaming is absolutely a place where you need to be literate. I think about it in the context of our own consultancy. Like over time, we think of ourselves as being like specialized. We're focused. We're strategic consultancy that help brands engage gamers. But I think longer term, the work that we do on the gaming side is going to be integrated into. If you want to just reach people, generally speaking, gaming needs to be a part of your toolkit. We're not there yet, but and certainly that creates a business opportunity for us. But I think longer term, it will become far more normalized as something that people do in some shape or capacity.
You have just listened
Jamin, it was
to
a
another
pleasure.
episode
Thank you
of
so
the
much for
Futurized
coming on the
podcast
show.
with me, Trond Arne Undheim, futurist, scholar, and author. If you are interested in my products or services, feel free to check out futurized.org/store, where you can book a keynote speech, become a sponsor or partner, request a podcast swap, or buy a few of my books, such as Augmented Lean, Health Tech, Future Tech, Pandemic Aftermath, Disruption Games, or Leadership from Below. If you're interested in any or all of my projects, check out my website, trondundheim.com, which has links to other podcasts as well as my public appearances. Thank you. Please share this show with those you care about. To find us on social media is easy. We are Futurized on LinkedIn and YouTube, and Futurized 2 on Instagram and Twitter. See you next time. Futurized, conversations that matter.